She was 18 years old, standing on a wooden platform in the middle of a dying town, with her wrists bound and a price tag around her neck. Not a price for livestock, not a price for land, a price for her. The crowd pressed close, men with sun-cracked faces and cold eyes, treating her like something left behind at a yard sale. Her father had gambled away everything, including his own daughter, and not one person in Red Hollow lifted a hand to stop it. But then, one man stepped forward, and nothing about what happened next was anything close to mercy. If this story already has you gripped, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning it all fell apart began like any other morning in Red Hollow. Gray, cold, and smelling like horse manure and bad decisions. Evelyn Mercer woke up on the floor of the back room at Harlan's saloon with a canvas sack under her head for a pillow and her coat pulled tight around her shoulders because the wood stove had gone out sometime in the night. She was 18 years old. She had 14 cents in her coat pocket, a pair of boots with a hole in the left sole, and a father who had not come home. That last part was not unusual. Thomas Mercer had been disappearing for years, first for hours, then for days, then for stretches of time that Evelyn had stopped counting because counting made it worse. He always came back, though, usually broke, always sorry, sometimes bruised. He'd sit across from her at whatever table they could afford that week, hold her hands in his big scarred ones, and say the same thing every time. "I'm going to fix it, Evie. I swear on your mother's grave, I'm going to fix it." He never fixed anything. But this time, when the saloon doors swung open at 7:30 in the morning and Harlan Goss himself walked into the back room, Evelyn knew something was different. Harlan was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with a face like old leather and a mustache that seemed to exist just to make him look meaner. He didn't come into the back room, ever. The back room was where he stored broken furniture and forgotten people, and he generally preferred to pretend both didn't exist. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he already knows is going to be a problem. "Your father's gone," he said. Evelyn sat up slowly. Her back ached from the floor. "Gone where?" Gone. Harlan crossed his thick arms. "Cleared out last night. Took the horse, what little cash he had left, and his good coat. Left you, the debt, and a note I am not going to read to you because it would make me angry." The cold in the room had nothing to do with the dead wood stove. "How much?" Evelyn asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She'd had practice, she supposed, at making her voice do things her insides weren't doing. Harlan rubbed the back of his neck. $340. Evelyn laughed, a short, humorless sound that surprised even her. $340 was not a debt. It was a life sentence. She'd been working odd jobs and mending clothes and doing whatever she could find since she was 14 years old, and she had never in her life held more than $11 at one time. "I can work," she said. "I can—" "Evelyn?" Harlan's voice dropped, and for a moment he almost looked sorry. Almost. "You don't understand. It ain't just me he owes. He borrowed from Clete Dunmore." The name hit the room like a stone dropped in still water. Clete Dunmore was not the kind of man you borrowed from and paid back late. He was not the kind of man you borrowed from at all, if you had any sense, which Thomas Mercer clearly did not. Dunmore ran everything in Red Hollow that wasn't nailed down by law, which, given that the town's sheriff was a 70-year-old man who spent most of his afternoons asleep in his office, was most of it. "He's already been here," Harlan continued, "this morning, before sunrise. He says the debt is yours now." "It's not mine. It doesn't matter what it is." Harlan's voice went flat. "What matters is what Dunmore says it is. And he says you're going to settle it." The way he said settle it made the hair on Evelyn's arms stand up. "How?" she said carefully. Harlan looked at the wall. He didn't answer. She found out 2 hours later when Clete Dunmore's men walked her to the center of Main Street with her wrists tied in front of her. Not tight enough to cut, just tight enough to make the point, and stood her up on the wooden platform they used for town announcements and the occasional livestock sale. Except today, there was no livestock, just Evelyn. The crowd gathered the way crowds always gather in small frontier towns. Slow at first, then all at once, like they could smell something happening from a mile away. Men came out of the saloon and the feed store and the barber shop. Women watched from windows. their faces careful and still. A few children stopped in the street until their mothers pulled them away without explanation. Cleet Dunmore stood at the base of the platform, dressed in his usual black coat and polished boots that had no business being that clean in a town this dirty. He was 40-something, handsome in the way that snakes are handsome, smooth and cold and perfectly put together. He had a smile that never reached his eyes, and right now he was wearing it. Thomas Mercer ran up a considerable debt in this town, he announced to the gathered crowd. He has chosen to abandon that debt. His daughter, by the laws of contract and obligation, inherits the responsibility. There were murmurs, not protests, murmurs. The sound of people deciding this was not their problem. Evelyn stood on the platform and kept her chin up. Her hands were shaking, so she pressed them together and held them still. She would not give them shaking. She would not give them tears. She had almost nothing left, but she still had that. The girl is young, healthy, and capable, Dunmore continued, in the same tone you'd use to describe a mule at a county fair. She'll make a fine addition to any household willing to settle the debt in full. Starting bid is $100. Starting bid. The words processed slowly, like cold molasses. Starting bid. Like she was a piece of furniture. Like she was a cow at auction. Like her entire existence could be valued, priced, and handed off to whoever raised their hand first. Somewhere in the crowd, a man she didn't recognize called out, 110. And then it began. She stopped hearing the individual numbers after a while. She focused instead on a point just above the crowd's heads. A strip of gray winter sky between the rooftops, pale and flat and enormous. She breathed slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. You're still here, she told herself. As long as you're still standing, you're still here. The bidding climbed to 180, then 200. The men making the bids were not men she wanted to look at. One of them was old Silas Fitch, who ran the freight operation on the east end of town and was known for working his employees 6 days to the bone. Another was a rancher named Devers, who'd buried 2 wives already and was looking for a third in the way most men look for a good hunting dog. Evelyn kept staring at that strip of sky. 220, 250. 260, called a voice she didn't recognize from somewhere near the back of the crowd. And then, silence. Not the usual pause between bids where men are calculating and shifting and checking their pockets. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that happens when something enters a room and changes the temperature. Evelyn lowered her gaze. The crowd had parted, not stepped aside politely, but actually moved, the way water moves around something large and solid. A man on horseback stood at the edge of the gathering, though stood wasn't quite right. His horse hadn't moved since Evelyn first noticed him. The animal was enormous, a dark bay with a white blaze running down its nose. And the man on its back sat the way men only sit when they've been on horseback most of their lives. Relaxed through the shoulders, weight settled deep in the saddle, completely still. He was tall, even mounted, you could tell. Broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that came from actual work rather than showing off. He had a dark hat pulled low, a jaw covered in several days of rough stubble, and eyes that Evelyn couldn't quite read from where she stood, though she had the distinct impression they didn't miss much. He had not bid, but he was watching. 260 going once, Dunmore called, his eyes flicking briefly to the man on horseback before cutting away. Going 340. The number landed on the crowd like a thrown stone. $340 was the exact amount of the debt. Not a dollar more, not a dollar less. It was not a bid made by a man who didn't know what he was doing. It was a statement. The man on the bay horse hadn't raised his voice. He'd set it at perfectly normal volume, which somehow made it louder than anything else spoken that morning. The crowd turned toward him like a single organism. Even Dunmore was still for a moment, which, if Evelyn had known the man better, she'd have understood was remarkable. Old Silas Fitch muttered something. No one tried to outbid. Dunmore recovered smoothly. He always recovered smoothly. Sold, he said, and smiled his cold smile, and gestured toward the man with one ringed hand. To Wyatt Boone. Wyatt Boone. Even Evelyn, who'd only been in Red Hollow for 3 months and knew almost no one, had heard that name. You didn't need to know people in this territory to hear about Wyatt Boone. His name moved through frontier towns the way weather moved through them. You didn't need to see it coming to know it was on its way. He was a cattle baron from up north, past the Hollow Creek Ridge, in the brutal country where winters came early and stayed late, and the land seemed to actively resist being settled. He'd lost his wife 2 years ago. Some people said to fever, some said to the hardship of the ranch itself. He had children, twins, a boy and a girl, and by all accounts, he was raising them alone, which perhaps explained why people described them the way they described wild animals. He was also, by every account she'd ever heard, utterly humorless, completely unreadable, and about as warm as the north face of a mountain in January. As Dunmore's man untied her wrists and guided her down off the platform, Evelyn told herself to breathe. She told herself this was survivable. She had survived her father's disappearances and their evictions, and the month they'd lived in a wagon because there was nowhere else to go. She had survived 17 different towns and 17 different versions of starting over. She could survive this. She walked toward the man on the horse. He watched her come. His expression didn't change, not to pity, not to satisfaction, not to anything she could name. When she stopped a few feet away and looked up at him, she found his eyes were a dark gray, like the sky before snow, and they were doing what she'd suspected from across the crowd, cataloging, calculating, assessing. She drew herself up to her full height, which was not impressive, but was all she had. "I don't know what you expect," she said, keeping her voice even. "But I want you to know I'm not afraid of work. I'll earn whatever you paid." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said in a voice low enough that only she could hear it, "I know you will." He reached down and held out one hand. She stared at it. She hadn't expected that. The courtesy of the gesture. She'd expected to be pointed toward a wagon, directed to climb in, and largely ignored. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him on the horse with an efficiency that suggested he'd done similar things before, though perhaps not in exactly these circumstances. "My name is Evelyn Mercer," she said behind him. "I know," he said. He turned the horse north and rode out of Red Hollow without another word, and Evelyn held on and watched the town shrink behind them and told herself she was not afraid. She was afraid, but she had practice at doing things afraid. Autumn. The ride north took most of the day. Wyatt Boone was not a man who filled silence with noise. For the first hour he said nothing at all, and Evelyn said nothing either, partly from pride, partly from the fact that her mind was still sorting through the morning's events like hands sorting through debris after a flood. Her father's gone. Cleet Dunmore. The platform. The crowd's faces. The number. $340. The land changed as they rode. Red Hollow sat in a shallow valley, dusty and brown, with the look of a place that had briefly considered thriving and then thought better of it. But north of town, the country opened up into something that took her breath away despite everything. Wide rolling hills covered in dry winter grass, the sky enormous above them, pale mountains visible in the far distance with dark timber on their lower slopes and white on their upper reaches. It was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, the way things are in places where the world hasn't been polished down by too many people. "How far is the ranch?" she finally asked. "Another 3 hours." "And the children?" A pause. Slight, but she noticed it. "At the ranch." "How old?" 9. "Both of them?" He didn't respond to that one, which she supposed was answer enough, given the twin situation. She tried a different angle. "How long since—" She stopped herself. She'd been about to ask about his wife, and that was not a road she was ready to walk down yet. "How long have you been ranching up here?" 12 years. "On your own?" "With hands. 6 of them." "And the children? Have they had anyone looking after them? A housekeeper, or—" "3 women," he said flatly. "In 2 years. First one lasted a month. Second, 6 weeks. Third made it to 2 months before she packed her things in the night." Evelyn absorbed this information. "What happened to them?" Another pause. When he answered, his voice was completely neutral, which somehow made it worse. "The work is hard. The winters are brutal. The twins are—" He seemed to search for the right word. "Difficult." "Difficult how?" "You'll see." It was not a reassuring answer. She wanted to press him further. She had a lot of questions, most of them fairly urgent. But something in the set of his shoulders told her they'd reached the limit of what he intended to share for now. She let the silence come back. The mountains got larger as they rode, and the temperature dropped with every mile north, and the sky turned the flat, heavy white of a sky that intends to snow. Evelyn pressed closer to the man in front of her by necessity. The cold was genuine and getting serious, and noticed that he didn't stiffen or shift away. He simply rode, solid and steady as the horse under them. She was 18 years old, riding behind a stranger toward an unknown place, with no money and no options, and nothing behind her except a father who'd chosen cards and flight over his own daughter. As long as you're still standing, she reminded herself, you're still here. Ishiyit. Iron Creek Ranch appeared out of the failing afternoon light like something from a dream, or a warning. It was big. That was the first thing. The main house was 2 stories, built from dark timber and stone, with a wide covered porch that ran the length of the front and fireplaces on both ends, whose chimneys were already producing smoke against the cold sky. Behind it, the outbuildings spread out in a practical cluster, a massive barn, a bunkhouse, what looked like a smokehouse, and a root cellar, and several structures she couldn't immediately identify. A split-rail fence ran the perimeter of the yard, and beyond it, the land rolled away in every direction, vast and windswept and empty. The house itself was large and well-built, but it had the look of a place that had stopped being maintained in certain small ways. A shutter hanging slightly crooked on an upstairs window, the porch railing patched with mismatched wood, a flower pot by the front door full of dead plants that no one had bothered to remove. It was the look of a house where there were not enough hours in the day for everything, and comfort had been the first thing to go. 2 ranch hands came out of the barn as they rode into the yard. They looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of men who had seen this before, not exactly hostile, but waiting to see which way the wind blew. Wyatt dismounted and reached up to help her down with that same plain efficiency from before. She slid off the horse and landed in the frozen mud of the yard and looked up at the house. That was when she heard them. The sound came from inside. 2 voices, both raised, both furious, in the overlapping, escalating way of an argument that had been going on for a while and was building towards something. One voice was higher, quicker, the word sharp. The other was slightly lower, its anger expressed in volume rather than speed. Wyatt's jaw tightened nearly imperceptibly. He handed the reins to one of the hands and headed for the front door without looking at Evelyn, which she took to mean she was supposed to follow. She followed. The front door opened into a wide entryway that led to a kitchen on one side and a sitting room on the other. The argument was coming from the sitting room, and as Evelyn stepped inside and the warmth of the wood stove hit her cold face, she saw its source. On one side of the room, a girl stood on top of the settee in her stocking feet, holding what appeared to be a wooden spoon like a weapon. She was small and fine-boned, with dark braids in various states of coming undone, and a face currently bright red with fury. On the other side, a boy the same size and coloring crouched behind the armchair, holding a wooden box in front of himself like a shield. Both of them were soaking wet. How they'd gotten soaking wet inside a sitting room was not immediately clear. "Was mine, and you knew it was mine," the girl was shouting. "I didn't break it on purpose, Clara. It was an accident. You never care about anything that belongs to me. I care more than you care about my—" "Enough." Wyatt's voice filled the room completely. Not a shout, something worse. The flat, total authority of a man who is not going to say it again. Both children went dead silent and turned toward him. And then they saw Evelyn behind him, and the silence shifted into something harder and more wary. Clara, the girl, climbed slowly down from the settee, her eyes fixed on Evelyn with an expression that contained about 11 different emotions, not one of them welcoming. Noah, the boy, straightened up from behind the chair and lowered his improvised shield, his own face doing something complicated. They were identical enough to be startling. Same dark hair, same gray eyes like their father's, same stubborn set to the jaw. But where Clara's emotion was all on the surface, bright and volatile, Noah's was more contained, watching, measuring, deciding. "Who is she?" Clara said. It was not a question. "Her name is Evelyn," Wyatt said. "She'll be staying with us." "For how long?" Noah said. "That depends," Wyatt said, which was not an answer. Clara looked Evelyn up and down with the utterly unself-conscious judgment of a 9-year-old. "You don't look like a housekeeper." "I'm not," Evelyn said. "Then what are you?" Evelyn considered this. "Undecided," she said. Clara blinked. It was clearly not the answer she'd been prepared for. Beside her, something flickered across Noah's face. Not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. "Go change your clothes," Wyatt told them. "Both of you, and someone is going to explain to me what happened in this room." The children disappeared up the stairs with a stomping speed that communicated their feelings without requiring any further words. Wyatt turned to Evelyn. He stood in the middle of his sitting room, which was warm and smoky and cluttered with the evidence of a household barely managing, and he looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes, and for the first time she thought she saw something in them that wasn't entirely flat. Exhaustion, maybe, or something close to it. "The room at the end of the upstairs hall is yours," he said. "There's a basin and pitcher. Supper's at 6. The hands eat separately." He paused. "The children eat with us." "That's fine," she said. He turned to go, then stopped without turning back. "I should tell you," he said, "that I didn't do what I did today because I think you need saving." She waited. "I did it because this house needs someone who doesn't run." He paused again, and she had the sense he was choosing words carefully, which was not something he seemed accustomed to doing. "The twins have had enough of people running." He went out the back toward what she guessed was the kitchen and left her standing in the middle of the sitting room alone. She looked around at the crooked picture frames and the ash on the stone hearth and the damp patches on the rug where whatever the children had been arguing about had apparently involved a significant amount of water. She looked at the curtains someone had hung once and never quite gotten straight, and the shelf of books with a layer of dust on them, and the rocking chair by the window that had a mended armrest on one side. A house that used to be cared for, and missed it. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door and went to find the kitchen. The room at the end of the upstairs hall was small and cold, with a single window that looked out over the barn and the dark hills beyond. There was a bed with a good thick quilt on it, a washstand with the promised basin and pitcher, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the back of the door. Someone had put a candle on the windowsill, already lit, which meant Wyatt, or someone in his employ, had anticipated she'd be arriving after dark. She sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes and let herself feel the day. It came in waves, the platform, and the cold, and her wrists in the rope, the numbers climbing, the silence that fell over the crowd like a held breath. 340. The ride north with the mountains growing and the temperature dropping and her father somewhere behind her, riding in the opposite direction, choosing to disappear rather than stand still and face anything at all. Her mother had been dead for 5 years. Her father, it turned out, had been gone for longer than that. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed, and did not cry, because crying required a kind of softness she couldn't afford right now. She could be soft later when she'd figured out the situation. Right now she needed to know the kitchen, and the children, and the routine of the ranch, and how the wood stove worked, and where they kept the food. She washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher and went back downstairs. Supper was a study in controlled tension. The kitchen was large and practical, with a cast-iron stove along one wall and a long table in the center that could seat 8 comfortably. Wyatt sat at the head. Clara sat across from Noah, who sat across from the empty chair that turned out to be Evelyn's. A ranch hand named Pete, apparently too old to eat with the others in the bunkhouse, sat at the far end and largely addressed himself to his food. The meal had been put together by someone who could cook the basics well enough, but hadn't had time or interest for anything beyond keeping people alive. Beans, salt pork, cornbread. It was fine. It was fuel. Clara spent the first 10 minutes elaborately not looking at Evelyn. Noah spent them watching her in the careful, sideways way of someone who doesn't want to be caught watching. "Do you know how to ride?" Clara said abruptly, into a lull in the silence. "Some," Evelyn said. "How much is some?" "Enough to stay on. Not enough to be useful about it." Clara seemed to find this acceptable in some way that was not immediately decipherable. "The last woman couldn't ride at all," she said. "She was scared of the horses." "I'm not scared of horses." "What are you scared of?" "Clara," Wyatt said without inflection. "It's a real question," Clara said, not backing down but lowering her volume slightly. Evelyn looked at her across the table. The girl had gotten her hair braided at some point between the sitting room disaster and supper. Badly, with loops that were already coming loose, but braided. She'd done it herself, Evelyn realized. She'd braided her own hair because there was no one to do it for her. Honestly, Evelyn said, right now I'm mostly scared of that. She nodded at the window, where the dark had come fully down and the wind had picked up, pressing at the glass. I don't know this country yet. I don't know what it does to you. Clara considered this. It tries to kill you, she said simply. If you let it. Then I won't let it, Evelyn said. The girl looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to her beans. Noah had stopped pretending not to watch. Wyatt, at the head of the table, was studying his plate, but the set of his shoulders had changed almost imperceptibly in a way Evelyn didn't have the context to read yet. After supper, while Evelyn cleared the table, the twins disappeared upstairs immediately, and Pete drifted out toward the bunkhouse, and Wyatt went somewhere in the back of the house to do whatever it was he did at night. She stood at the basin washing dishes in cold water and listened to the wind working at the eaves. 3 women in 2 years, she thought. A month, 6 weeks, 2 months. She scrubbed the cast iron pan and thought about the girl's words. It tries to kill you, if you let it. 9 years old, and she already knew that about the world. She'd learned it the same way children learn the things they shouldn't have to learn too young, by watching the adults around her not survive it. Evelyn dried the pan and hung it back on its hook and stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, looking at the room. Then she went to the shelf above the stove where the supplies were kept and took inventory. Flour, salt, dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, coffee, a tin of molasses, dried apple rings. In the root cellar, she'd have to check tomorrow, but up here, there were ingredients, she decided, for something better than what they'd had tonight. Not much better, but some. And some, right now, was worth working with. She put out the kitchen lantern and went upstairs to bed. Sleep came fast and deep, the way it does when you're exhausted all the way through, and when she woke, it was still dark, somewhere in the deep cold of early morning. She lay still for a moment and listened to the house. Wind, still, the creak of old timber settling against the cold, and then, faint and almost inaudible, something else. She was out of the bed before she'd fully decided to move, her feet on the cold plank floor, wrapping her coat around her shoulders over her nightgown. She opened her door quietly and stepped into the hallway. The sound was coming from behind the door across from hers. Clara's room. She stood in the dark hallway and listened. Not crying, or not only crying, something lower and more ragged, the sound of a person trying not to make noise while being overwhelmed by something they couldn't stop. Evelyn stood there for a moment with her hand raised to knock and didn't knock, because she knew from experience that there are moments when a knock is an intrusion and moments when silence is an abandonment, and knowing the difference is everything, and she didn't know this child well enough yet to know which this was. She lowered her hand. She went back to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to the wind and the distant sound of a grieving child, and she made a decision that was not grand or heroic, just the kind of small, quiet decision that determines the shape of everything that comes after. Tomorrow, she told herself. Find a way in. Not through the front door. They'll slam it. Through the side, slow. Find the thing they need that no one has thought to give them. The wind pressed at the window. You're still here, she thought. The same thing she'd told herself on the platform, in the cold, with her wrists bound and the crowd watching. She lay back down under the thick quilt and closed her eyes. She was still here. And tomorrow, she was going to start figuring out how to stay. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the cold, though the cold was genuine and relentless. The kind that got into your boots before breakfast and stayed there all day, working its way up through your bones until you couldn't remember what warm felt like. Not because of the work, though the work was endless and physical in a way that left her hands cracked and her back aching before noon. The hardest part of the first week was learning the rhythm of a household that had stopped having one. Evelyn woke before everyone else each morning by habit and necessity because the kitchen stove needed feeding before the house temperature became unbearable, and because she'd discovered, on day 2, that nobody else was going to do it. The previous arrangement had apparently been that the twins got themselves up and ate whatever was available, and Wyatt cooked something in the evenings when he came in from the range, and the space between those two events was largely unstructured, and nobody had thought too hard about it. She restructured it, quietly, without announcing she was doing it. She started with breakfast. Real breakfast. Not just cold cornbread left over from the night before. Oatmeal with the dried apple rings she'd found in the pantry, or fried corn cakes if she had time, or eggs when the hens were cooperating, which was not reliably. It wasn't anything elaborate, but it was hot, and it was ready when the twins came down the stairs, and the first morning Clara stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at the table like she'd never seen it set before. "You cooked," Clara said. "That's generally how food gets made," Evelyn said. Clara sat down without another word and ate 2 full bowls of oatmeal, which told Evelyn more than any conversation could have. Noah was harder to read. He came in behind his sister, sat down, and ate methodically without comment, watching Evelyn from under his brows the way a dog watches someone it hasn't decided about yet. He wasn't hostile, not exactly. He was just waiting. For what? She wasn't sure. For her to do something wrong, maybe. Or for her to leave, which was probably the smarter bet based on the available evidence. She didn't do either. The ranch hands were a different problem. There were 6 of them, as Wyatt had said. Pete, who ate at the house, a young one named Decker, who couldn't have been more than 20, a weathered pair of brothers called Amos and Cal, who kept to themselves, a former army man named Briggs, who had an opinion about everything, and a quiet Tejano named Reyes, who was, based on what she could observe, the most competent person on the property, including Wyatt. They were civil enough to her face. Behind her back, she knew, was a different story, because Briggs was not quiet about his opinions, and old ranch buildings carried sound better than people remembered. "She won't last past first snowfall," she heard him say one afternoon, from the other side of the barn wall while she was filling the water trough. "None of them do. Boone ought to just accept that this isn't a house for women and move on." She kept filling the trough. She didn't say anything to Wyatt about it. She didn't have the kind of relationship with him yet where she said anything to him about much at all. Their evenings followed a sparse, functional pattern: supper, during which he asked the twins brief questions about their day, and they gave brief answers, and then he disappeared into his office or out to the barn for the night checks, and Evelyn cleaned up and went to bed. He was not cold to her exactly. He was simply removed, like a man managing his circumstances rather than living in them. She understood it, even if she didn't like it. What broke the pattern, the first real crack in the careful distance between them, was Clara's hair. It was day 9. Evelyn had come downstairs to find Clara at the kitchen table before breakfast, struggling furiously with her own braid, arms twisted back, face red, a tangle forming that was going to be genuinely painful to undo. She'd clearly been at it for a while. The results were getting worse, not better. "Here," Evelyn said, setting down the coffee pot. "I can do it," Clara said immediately. "I know you can," Evelyn said, which was not technically true but was the right thing to say. "Scoot your chair out." Clara hesitated. Evelyn waited, not pushing. She'd learned already that pushing Clara was like pushing a door that opened inward. You just drove it more firmly shut. After a moment, Clara scooted her chair out. Evelyn sat behind her and began working the tangles loose with her fingers before reaching for the comb. Clara sat rigid at first, braced for something, though what she was braced for Evelyn couldn't have said. Pain, maybe. Or judgment. Or the specific impatience of someone doing something they'd rather not be doing. Evelyn worked slowly and didn't speak, and after a few minutes, Clara's shoulders came down about an inch, then another inch. "Mama used to do this," Clara said, very quietly. Evelyn kept her hands gentle and her voice the same. "Did she braid it every day?" "Every morning before school. When we had school." A pause. "We don't have school anymore. Papa does lessons sometimes, but he's too busy." "What kind of lessons?" "Reading, numbers. He's good at numbers." Another pause, longer. "He's not good at braids." Evelyn worked the last of the tangles out and began the braid properly, sectioning the hair into thirds with care. "No," she agreed. "I expect not." Something small shifted in the room. Clara didn't say anything else, but when Evelyn finished and tied off the braid with the ribbon she'd found in the tin on the windowsill, the girl put her hand up and touched it carefully, the way you touch something you're checking is real. She didn't say thank you. Evelyn didn't need her to. Noah saw it from the doorway. He'd been standing there long enough to witness the whole thing, though he retreated into the hallway before Clara turned around, and by the time Clara went to find him, he was apparently upstairs and completely innocent of any eavesdropping. Evelyn poured the coffee and started the corn cakes and let it be. The next morning, Clara came downstairs and sat in the chair in front of Evelyn's without being asked. That was the beginning. It didn't become easy after that. She'd have been suspicious of easy out here in a household this bruised. But it became navigable. She found that Noah, beneath his wariness, was desperate for something to do with his hands. The twins had been largely unsupervised for 2 years, and boredom had curdled into the destructive energy she'd witnessed that first evening. She started giving him tasks in the kitchen. Small things at first, cracking eggs, measuring flour, watching the pot so it didn't boil over. He resisted initially because kitchens were apparently for women, and he was 9 and had opinions about such matters. Baking bread isn't women's work, Evelyn told him one afternoon when he'd stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed for 3 minutes straight. It's hungry work, for people who are hungry. I'm not hungry, Noah said. You just ate half a pan of corn cake. That was earlier. It's been 40 minutes. He uncrossed his arms. Fine, he said, which was Noah's version of enthusiasm. They made bread that afternoon. Badly, the first time, because Evelyn let him do most of it himself, and the dough came out stiff, and the loaf rose crooked and the bottom got slightly burned where the heat was uneven. But Noah stood at the table and looked at what he'd made, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite pride. More like surprise. The surprise of discovering you could make a thing. It's ugly, he said. It is, Evelyn agreed. Does it taste all right? He broke off a piece and chewed it, thinking seriously. Kind of. Then it did what bread is supposed to do. We'll fix the rest next time. He looked at her sideways. You're not going to tell me it's perfect. It's not perfect, but you made it. Those are different things. He thought about that for a moment and then wrapped the loaf in the cloth she handed him to take to the bunkhouse, which was where she'd told him imperfect bread went, to men who'd been working outside all day and would eat anything. He came back 20 minutes later and reported that Reyes said it was better than the bread Amos made, which Amos had also heard, and there had apparently been words. Evelyn kept a straight face. Good, she said. The bunkhouse incident did something strange to the atmosphere on the ranch. Briggs's commentary behind her back didn't stop, but the other men, Reyes, Decker, even the Quiet brothers, started acknowledging her in the yard. A nod. A hat tipped. Small things. The language of people who'd decided someone was worth the minimum acknowledgement, Wyatt noticed. She wasn't sure how much he noticed. He was gone before full light and back after dark most days, and the hours in between were his own business. But there were moments at supper when she'd look up and find him watching something. Clara laughing at something Evelyn had said, or Noah explaining the bread situation to his father with a seriousness that suggested this was the most important subject they'd ever discussed. And Wyatt's face would do that thing she'd started to recognize, a tension in the jaw releasing briefly, like a man letting out a breath he'd been holding so long he'd stopped noticing it. He still didn't talk to her much, but the silence between them had changed quality. It was less like the silence of two strangers forced into proximity, and more like the silence of two people who were beginning to understand how the other one moved through a room. One evening in the 3rd week, a storm came down from the north hard and fast, the kind that turned the yard into a white wall within an hour, and the hands got the animals in and the shutters latched and everyone went to ground for the night. Evelyn had made a big pot of stew in anticipation. She'd smelled the change in the air since afternoon, that particular cold iron smell of serious weather, and the kitchen was warm and loud for once, Clara and Noah both talking over each other about something that had happened with the barn cats, and Pete eating with the particular contentment of an old man who'd been cold all day and was now warm. Wyatt came in last, shedding his coat and hat in the entryway, snow melting off his shoulders. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at the scene, the full table, the lamplight, the pot on the stove, and something passed over his face so quickly she almost missed it. She didn't miss it. She set a bowl in front of his place and went back to the stove. Later, after the children were in bed and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse through the tunnel of cold between the two buildings, Evelyn was finishing the dishes when she heard him come back into the kitchen. She thought he was getting the coffee pot. She didn't turn around. You don't have to do all of it, he said behind her. She kept washing. Do all of what? Everything. A pause. She could hear him standing still in the middle of the kitchen, which was unusual. Wyatt was not a man who stood still without purpose. The cooking, the children, He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "You're not a servant." She did turn around then, because the statement required looking at him to understand what he meant by it. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, but not defensively. More like he needed something solid behind him for this particular conversation. "Then what am I?" she asked, genuinely curious. He met her eyes. "I don't know yet," he said, but not that. It was not a romantic statement. She didn't take it as one. It was something more fundamental than that. An acknowledgement, blunt and plain-spoken in the way he was plain-spoken about everything, that she was a person in this house and not a fixture. It was enough. She turned back to the dishes. "Clara's going to need new boots before winter gets worse. The ones she has are too small. I notice she's been tying the laces loose to fit." A long pause. "I'll get her some. And Noah's coat has a tear in the lining. I can mend it if you have thread." "In the drawer by the stove, second one." "All right." She heard him move toward the door and then stop again. She waited. "The bread," he said, "that Noah made." "What about it?" Another pause, shorter. "It was better than what we've been eating." She kept her face toward the basin so he couldn't see the expression on it. "I'll tell him that." The kitchen door opened and closed, and she was alone again, and the storm pressed at the shuttered windows. And somewhere upstairs 2 9-year-olds were sleeping in warm beds with full stomachs. And for the first time since she'd ridden north out of Red Hollow, Evelyn let herself feel something that was not just survival. It wasn't happiness, exactly. Not yet. It was smaller than that, and more honest. The feeling of a thing that had been broken beginning very slowly in some of its smaller pieces to be put back together. She dried the last dish, banked the stove for the night, and went upstairs. In the hallway, she stopped outside Clara's door and listened. No sound but the child's quiet breathing and the storm working at the eaves. She stood there for a moment in the dark and let herself notice that the house no longer felt quite as haunted as it had on the first night. Then she went to bed and slept without dreaming, while outside the snow built up against the fence posts and the mountains disappeared behind the White and Iron Creek Ranch held against the weather the way it had held against every winter before this one. Imperfect, a little battered, but still standing. The snow had been building for 3 days straight when Clara came down to breakfast and didn't eat. That was the first sign, though Evelyn didn't know it yet. She noticed it. Clara always ate with the focused efficiency of a child who'd spent enough time uncertain about meals to never take them for granted, but she thought the girl was sulking about something, the way 9-year-olds sulk, silently and with great commitment. She'd had a disagreement with Noah the evening before about something involving the barn cats again, and the aftermath had been chilly at the supper table. So Evelyn set Clara's oatmeal in front of her and didn't push, and went back to the stove. It was Noah who said something 20 minutes later when Clara had barely touched her bowl and was sitting with her chin in her hand staring at nothing. "Your face is red," he said. "It's the stove," Clara said. "You're far from the stove." "Leave me alone." "You look weird." "Noah," Evelyn said from across the kitchen. "She does, though," he said, but quieter. Evelyn crossed to the table and put her hand against Clara's forehead before the girl could pull back, and the heat she felt there made something tighten in her chest immediately. Not the warmth of a kitchen morning, something deeper, more insistent. She kept her hand there a moment and kept her face even. "Come on," she said. "Back upstairs." "I'm fine," Clara said. "You're not fine. Come on." She got the girl back to bed and pulled the quilts up and went back downstairs. And she was halfway through telling herself it was probably just a mild fever. Children get mild fevers. It was nothing to be alarmed about, when she heard the sound from upstairs that stopped her cold on the bottom step. Noah. She took the stairs 2 at a time. He was in his room, still dressed, sitting on the edge of his bed with both arms wrapped around himself. And his face had the same terrible flush as his sister's, the high bright color of a fever climbing fast. He looked up at her when she came in, and for the first time since she'd known him, the careful watchfulness in his eyes was completely gone. He just looked scared. "My head hurts," he said, "and I'm cold." She put her hand on his forehead. Hotter than Clara, or it felt that way. Her own heart was doing something unhelpful, so she steadied it deliberately. "All right," she said. "Into bed." "Is it bad?" "I'm going to take care of it," she said, which wasn't an answer, And he was sharp enough to notice, but he let her pull off his boots and get him under the quilts without arguing. She went back downstairs, moving fast now, and that was where she found Wyatt. He'd come in from the morning check early, which he almost never did. He stood in the kitchen doorway with snow still on his coat, and she could tell from the way he was standing that he already knew something was wrong. He'd heard her on the stairs, probably, or seen something in her face from across the room. His own face went careful and still, in the particular way it went careful and still when he was managing something difficult. Both of them, she said before he could ask. Fever, high, and climbing. The blood left his face. She watched it happen, the color going out of him like a lamp turned down, something behind his eyes shifting from a man who handled hard things into something older and more frightened than that. She understood it in the same moment she saw it. She'd heard the story from Pete, 3 weeks in, delivered in the matter-of-fact way Pete delivered most information. Boone's wife went the same way. Fever started fast, and she was gone in 4 days, nothing the doctor could do by the time he got there through the snow. She hadn't fully understood the weight of it until this moment. How high? He said. His voice was controlled, but only just. High enough. I need to know what medicine you have in this house. Everything. He crossed the kitchen to the cabinet above the dry sink and opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. There was willow bark, dried, which she could make into a tea, a bottle of something labeled with the druggist's handwriting she couldn't fully read, a tin of camphor salve. Not much. I need to go for the doctor, he said. The doctor is 20 miles and a blizzard away. I know where the doctor is. Wyatt. She waited until he looked at her. Even if you could get there, and you might not be able to get there, not in this, it would take you 8 hours round trip at best. In 8 hours, those fevers can do a lot. I need you here. He stood with his hands on the counter and looked at the cabinet, and she could see him doing the math, the terrible arithmetic of the situation, and coming up with the same answer she had. You know what you're doing, he said. It came out partly question, partly something more desperate than that. I know enough, she said. My mother was sick for 2 years before she died. I learned what I could. She pulled the willow bark down from the shelf. Get me as much clean water as you can boil, and every spare quilt in the house. And then I need you to not panic, because the children will know if you're panicking. His jaw tightened. I don't panic. You're panicking right now. A silence. He looked at her and something moved through his face. Not anger, though it might have looked like anger from a distance. More like a man confronting the limits of his own control and hating every second of it. Tell me what to do, he said. So she told him. The next several hours were the kind that compress and stretch simultaneously. Moments that lasted forever, and stretches of time that vanished without her knowing where they went. She moved between the 2 rooms constantly, checking temperatures with the back of her hand, getting water between lips that had gone dry and cracked, changing the cool cloths she'd laid on their foreheads when they warmed too fast. Noah's fever spiked first, hard and sudden, and he stopped making sense for a while, talking about something she couldn't follow, his eyes open but not focused. And that was the worst 30 minutes she'd had since the auction platform, standing over a delirious child in the howling dark, while a blizzard systematically attempted to end the world outside. Wyatt stood in the doorway of Noah's room during that stretch, and she let him stand there because his presence was something the boy could feel even if he couldn't see it properly, and because she needed him to see that she was not going to fall apart. She boiled water and made the willow bark tea as strong as she dared, and got it into them in small amounts, a spoonful at a time, over and over, the way you'd water a plant that had gone too dry. Not all at once, but steadily, patiently, refusing to accept that it was too far gone. Clara was more coherent than her brother, which was almost harder to manage. She lay in her bed with the quilts piled high, and her dark eyes tracking Evelyn whenever she moved, and she asked questions in a small, thin voice that didn't sound like Clara at all. Am I going to die? Evelyn wrung out the cloth in the cold water and folded it and laid it gently across the girl's forehead. No. How do you know? Because I'm not going to let that happen. People say that, Clara said. Mama's nurse said something like that. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her directly. I know. And I know that's not a promise I can make you. That means the same thing it should mean. But I can tell you what I see, which is that your fever hasn't gotten worse in the last hour. That's something. Clara thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Okay, she said finally. Okay? I believe you. A pause. Don't leave. I'm not leaving, Evelyn said. She didn't leave. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening without stopping. And at some point, Wyatt appeared beside her in the hallway between the two rooms with a cup of coffee and held it out without speaking, and she took it and drank it standing up. And he stood with his back against the wall, looking at the floor in the way he looked at things when he was thinking hard. She asked me once, he said very quietly, if I thought her mother felt it. The fever. He stopped. Evelyn waited. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. You don't have to say anything, Evelyn said. You just have to stay where they can see you. He looked up at her. Is that enough? For them? Right now? Yes. He nodded, a single, short movement. He didn't say anything else. He went back into Noah's room and sat in the chair beside the bed, which he'd pulled up close, and he put his large hand over his son's smaller one and sat there. And Evelyn turned away and went back to Clara because it was not her moment to witness, and she knew it. The night was the worst of it. The blizzard reached something close to its peak around midnight, and the sound of it against the house was so constant and total that it stopped sounding like wind and started sounding like something alive, a pressure from outside, testing seams, looking for a way in. The wood stove burned as hot as she dared push it. The candles in both rooms stayed lit. She lost track of how many times she went between one room and the other, how many cloths she changed, how many spoonfuls of tea she measured out. She was running on nothing but cold water and the stubborn refusal to sit down. Somewhere around 2 a.m, she was sitting on the floor between the two doorways. She'd positioned herself there so she could hear both children at once, when she became aware that Wyatt was sitting against the wall a few feet from her. She wasn't sure how long he'd been there. His children were both sleeping, fitfully, but sleeping, and he'd apparently decided this was the closest thing to a safe moment, and he'd taken it. He looked terrible. She imagined she didn't look much better. They sat in the dim hallway and listened to the storm and the quieter sounds of two children sleeping through their fevers, and after a while Wyatt said, into the dark, I don't do this well. She looked over at him. Do what well? This. He gestured vaguely, which seemed to mean the hallway, the night, the helplessness. Waiting, not being able to fix it. Nobody does that well. I should be, he stopped himself. I keep thinking I should be doing something. You are doing something, she said. You've been in that room with him for 5 hours. You're here. She hesitated, then said what she thought needed saying. He knows. Even when he's not making sense, some part of him knows you're there. Wyatt looked at the floor for a long time. Then he said, so quietly she almost missed it under the sound of the storm. After Sarah died, I told myself if I just worked hard enough, kept the ranch running, kept the hands busy, kept everything moving, they'd be all right. The children. He paused. That was wrong of me. Evelyn didn't say it wasn't wrong, because it was wrong, and he knew it was wrong, and he didn't need her to soften it. You were grieving, she said instead. People do stupid things when they're grieving, usually the things that feel most like control. Is that what it was? I think so. He was quiet for a long moment. Did you grieve when your father left? The question surprised her. She sat with it for a moment, honest about the answer. I grieved him a long time before he left, she said. The leaving was just the end of something that had already mostly ended. He turned his head and looked at her then, really looked at her, in the way he occasionally looked at things when he forgot to keep his expression managed. She thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He just looked, and she held it, and the storm pressed at the walls of the house, and the candles flickered in both rooms, and the night stretched on. Dawn came in without drama, the way dawns come in after bad nights. Not triumphant, just present. The light crept under the shuttered windows, gray and pale and cold, and Evelyn became aware of it because the quality of dark in the hallway had changed. She had apparently slept, though she couldn't have said when. She was sitting with her back against the wall and her neck aching and a quilt around her shoulders that she had no memory of putting there. Wyatt was gone from the hall. She got up, stiff and slow, and went to Clara's room first. The girl was sleeping, still, but the flush in her face was different, softer, less violent. Evelyn put her hand to her forehead and felt the difference immediately. The fever was lower. Not gone, but lower, and coming down in the way fevers come down when they've been fought to a standstill. She crossed the hall to Noah. Wyatt was in the chair, awake, his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He looked up when she came in. Noah was awake too, lying on his side under the quilts, looking exhausted in the boneless, transparent way of children who've been genuinely sick, but his eyes were focused and clear, which was the most important thing. "She put cold things on my head all night," Noah said. His voice was rough. "It was annoying." "I know," Evelyn said. "I didn't say stop," he added. She sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand to his forehead. Cooler than last night, meaningfully cooler. The tightness that had lived in her chest since morning the day before released, not all at once, but in a long, slow exhale that she kept quiet. "How's Clara?" Wyatt said behind her. "Better. Fever's coming down." He didn't respond. She turned and found him with his face turned away, toward the window. His jaw was working in the tight, controlled way of a man who is not going to let himself come apart in front of his son, and she respected it, and she stood up quietly and said she was going to start the stove and went out of the room and let him have the moment. In the hallway, she stopped, put her back against the wall in the same spot she'd sat for most of the night, let her eyes close for just a second. Her legs hurt. Her hands were dry and cracked from the cold water. She had slept maybe 2 hours and eaten nothing since yesterday morning. She was still standing. From inside Noah's room, very faintly, she heard a sound she hadn't heard from Wyatt Boone in the 6 weeks she'd known him. Something low and private, a man releasing something he'd been carrying a long time in the presence of a child who was too young to understand it fully, but old enough to put his hand on his father's arm. She went downstairs and built the fire back up. By mid-morning, both children were sitting up. By afternoon, Clara was asking for oatmeal, which Evelyn made with a generous pour of molasses that the girl ate in total, focused silence. Noah ate half a bowl and fell asleep again, which was exactly what he was supposed to do. The storm had broken sometime before dawn, and the world outside was white and still and almost offensively quiet after the violence of the night. Wyatt came into the kitchen in the early afternoon while Evelyn was washing out the sick rags at the basin. She heard him stop behind her, and she kept working. "Evelyn," he said. She turned around. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and he looked at her, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not managed, not careful, not controlled. Just open, in the stripped bare way that people's faces go open after a night like the one they'd just survived. He said, "Thank you," and the two words sat in the room like something heavier and more complicated than thanks. She nodded. She didn't say it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing, and he wouldn't have believed her anyway. She didn't say anything, actually. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to the basin. He stood there a moment longer. Then she heard him move, and the back door open, and the cold come in briefly before the door closed again. She looked at her hands in the water and let herself feel it, the exhaustion and the relief and something else, something she hadn't quite named yet, that had been building since a gray winter morning on an auction platform and had arrived, quietly, somewhere during the long hours of a blizzard night, in a house that had started out broken and was still broken but was maybe, slowly, becoming something else. She wrung out the last rag and draped it over the basin edge to dry. She had work to do. The twins recovered slowly, the way children recover from real sickness. Not all at once, but in installments, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, with good days followed by days when they were too tired to do much besides sit by the stove and be irritable about it. Evelyn managed this without complaint and without the particular brand of hovering that makes sick children feel worse, which Clara appreciated enough to say so, in her characteristically sideways fashion. "You're not annoying when we're sick," Clara told her, on the 4th day of recovery, from her position on the settle with a quilt around her shoulders. "High praise," Evelyn said. "The second woman, the one who stayed 6 weeks, she kept touching our foreheads every 5 minutes. It made Noah want to bite her." "I did bite her," Noah said from the other end of the settle. "Once, by accident." "It wasn't an accident," Clara said. "It was mostly an accident." Evelyn kept her face straight and went back to the stove. Behind her she could feel, rather than see, the twins sharing one of their private looks. The twin language of 2 people who have been each other's primary company for most of their lives and have developed a communication system that doesn't require words. She understood without anyone telling her that she had passed something. Not a test exactly. It wasn't that calculated. More like a threshold. The night of the blizzard had rearranged something in the household the way a hard storm rearranges a landscape, leaving everything essentially where it was, but somehow different in its proportions. What she hadn't anticipated was how visible that change would be to people outside the ranch. Red Hollow was 20 miles south, but 20 miles on the frontier was not the distance it would be anywhere else. Men rode it for supplies, for whiskey, for the particular kind of human contact that months of winter isolation made necessary. Wyatt's hands made the trip every few weeks, and they talked the way men talk when they've been in each other's company too long, freely, without thinking too hard about what traveled and what didn't. It traveled. She found out the way she found out most things on Iron Creek, indirectly, through the environment rather than through anyone telling her directly. It was Decker who let it slip, 3 weeks after the fever, while she was helping him rehang the barn door that had warped in the cold. He was 21 and not skilled at guarding what was on his face. "Heard some things when I was in town," he said, too casually. "What kind of things?" she said. He focused very hard on the hinge he was working. People talking, about the ranch, about you and Boone. She kept holding the door steady. "What are they saying?" Decker's ears went red. He was, fundamentally, a decent young man in a situation he hadn't expected. That Boone's gone soft over the girl he bought at auction." He winced slightly at his own sentence. "Those are their words, not mine." "What else?" That some people think you've been working an angle, since the beginning." He said it fast, like removing a splinter. "That a smart girl in a bad spot would know how to make herself useful to a wealthy man." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The barn door was heavy, and she was taking most of its weight. "Hold this," she said. He grabbed it. She stepped back and looked at the alignment, and then she looked at him. "Is that what Briggs says?" she asked. Decker opened his mouth and closed it again. "It's fine," she said. "I already know what Briggs says. He's been saying it since October. He's not... the others don't..." "I know," she said, and picked up the other side of the door again. "Let's get this hung." She didn't think about it for the rest of that day. She was deliberate about that. She'd learned a long time ago that thinking about things while you're in the middle of other things was a way of doing neither properly. She finished the door and made supper and did the evening routine with the twins, who were back at the kitchen table for lessons now. Noah working through a mathematics problem with the focused intensity he brought to anything involving numbers, and Clara drawing something elaborate in the margin of her copybook that was probably more interesting than whatever she was supposed to be writing. It was only after the house was quiet that she let herself sit with it. The gossip itself didn't surprise her. She'd understood from the first morning in Red Hollow, standing on that platform, that people were going to tell a story about her, and that she didn't have much control over what story they chose. What surprised her was the feeling the story produced. Not shame, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular helplessness of being misread by people who decided what you were before you opened your mouth. She was sitting with this at the kitchen table, the lantern burning low, when she heard Wyatt's boots on the floor behind her. He came in from the cold, and she didn't turn around. "Decker told you," he said. Not a question. He mentioned it. She heard him hang up his coat. He came to the table and sat down across from her, which was unusual. He generally didn't sit at the table unless it was a meal. He put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them. "I've heard it too," he said. "Briggs has been talking to men in town, apparently, more than I knew." "What do they say when you hear it?" "What do you mean?" What do you say back?" He was quiet for a moment. "So far I've said nothing, because I've been figuring out what I think." She looked at him then. His face was doing the careful internal thing it did when he was working through something he didn't have easy language for. "And have you figured it out?" she asked. "Working on it," he said. He met her eyes briefly and then looked back at his hands. "What they're saying, that the angle, the calculation, that's not what I've seen here. Since the day you arrived." He paused. "But I understand why it's an easy story, given how you came here. Given that you bought me at auction." He didn't flinch from it. "Yes. Do you think that story, the one they're telling, does it bother you?" He considered this with the seriousness she'd come to expect from him. It bothers me that they're saying it about you, he said. Not about me. About you. She hadn't expected that distinction, and she let herself register it. People will say whatever they decide to say, she told him. I've been the subject of people's stories my whole life. The gambler's girl, the charity case, the auctioned orphan. I can't stop them making up the story. I can only know what the truth is. And what is the truth? He asked, very quietly. She held his gaze across the table. That I came here with nothing and I worked. That I care about your children. That I'm not running a calculation. I don't have enough left in me for calculations. And honestly, I never did. He nodded slowly. His eyes didn't leave hers, and the lamplight was low and the house was still, and it was the kind of moment that has weight to it. The kind you remember later as a turning point even while it's happening, even though nothing dramatic occurs in it. Two people at a table in the dark, being honest with each other. I'm going to handle it, he said. You don't have to. I'm going to handle it, he said again, and there was a finality in his voice that she recognized. The same voice he used when he'd made a decision and the deciding was done. She didn't argue. She'd learned that arguing with Wyatt Boone on a closed matter was like arguing with the weather. What she didn't expect was how he chose to handle it, or when. The cattle gathering at Red Hollow happened every late winter, when the ranchers in the territory brought their remaining stock down from the higher ranges ahead of the final deep freeze, and the big trading happened before spring. It was, by the standards of the frontier, a significant social event. Dozens of men, some of their families, traders, and buyers from further territories, and all the accompanying commerce and gossip and settling of old scores that accumulated when people who'd been isolated for months finally got into the same space. Wyatt had been going every year for a decade. He went for business primarily because business required his presence. Iron Creek ran the largest herd in the northern range, and the transactions made at the Red Hollow gathering accounted for a significant portion of his annual income. He didn't enjoy it. He went, he worked, he came home. This year, he asked Evelyn to come with him. She stood in the kitchen when he said it and looked at him carefully. Why? Because I want you there. That's not a reason. Yes, it is. She could have argued further. She chose not to. Partly because she understood something was being said here that wasn't only about a cattle gathering, and partly because she had her own reasons for being willing to go back to Red Hollow. She hadn't faced that town since the morning she'd left it on the back of his horse, and there was a part of her that knew she needed to. They left the twins with Pete, who accepted this assignment with the philosophical resignation of a man who had survived many winters and considered two 9-year-olds manageable in comparison. Clara told him, as they were loading the wagon, that she was in charge while her father was gone. Pete said that was fine, as long as she understood he was also in charge, and the two of them worked out a satisfactory power-sharing arrangement before the wagon was out of the yard. The ride to Red Hollow took most of a morning. They sat side by side on the wagon bench with the cold moving around them and the hills white on both sides of the track. And Wyatt drove, and she sat with her hands in her coat pockets, and between them the silence had the comfortable, unself-conscious quality it had been developing for weeks. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have enough to say that they can take their time about it. Are you going to tell me what you're planning to do? She asked, somewhere around the halfway point. No, he said. That's not reassuring. I know. She looked at the road ahead and accepted this answer for what it was. Red Hollow looked the same as she'd left it. The same dusty main street, the same lean buildings, the same air of a place that was neither thriving nor quite dying. The gathering had swelled the population considerably. Horses and wagons packed the street, men moving between the corral and the trading post, and the saloon with the particular purposeful energy of people conducting business. The smell of wood smoke and cattle was everywhere. People noticed them arrive. She felt it, the attention moving through the crowd the way attention moves, in the small adjustments of posture and the redirecting of eyes. She kept her back straight and her chin level, and she stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help and stood in the frozen street of the town where she'd been sold 2 months ago, and she let them look. Wyatt conducted his business through the morning. She stayed close, but not deferentially close. She moved at her own pace, spoke to people when spoken to, and watched the crowd the way she'd learned to watch environments that required careful navigation. Dunmore was not present, which she was relieved by. His absence felt like luck she didn't fully trust. Briggs was there. She saw him across the corral, talking to a group of men she didn't know, and she saw the moment he saw her. A slight pause, and then a deliberate turn away. The moment came in the afternoon. She didn't know it was coming. She was standing near the trading post when she became aware that Wyatt had positioned himself at the edge of the corral fence, where a cluster of the territory's ranchers had gathered, men with standing, men whose opinions traveled far and settled hard. Hatcher from the southern range, who'd been running cattle for 30 years. Willis, who controlled the eastern water rights. 3 or 4 others whose names she knew by reputation. Wyatt was not a man who made speeches. He barely made sentences longer than necessary. So what happened next was out of character enough that it silenced the surrounding conversation within a few seconds of him starting. "I want to say something," he said, in a carrying voice that wasn't a shout but didn't need to be. The kind of voice a man has when the land and the work have given him authority that doesn't require volume. About what's been going around. People were listening, more than the immediate group, the attention of the gathered crowd turning toward him as it had turned away from him when he'd arrived. "Evelyn Mercer came to this ranch 2 months ago," he said, "under circumstances that weren't her fault and weren't her choice. In those 2 months, she has kept this household running, looked after my children, and held my family together through a night that I—" He stopped for a fraction of a second, and she understood what was in that pause. "Through a night I couldn't have survived without her." He was looking at the men in front of him, but his voice was loud enough to carry. "I've heard the stories that have been told about her, that she's working an angle, that she's a clever girl from nowhere making the best of a rich man's situation." His voice didn't change pitch or temperature, which made it more pointed, not less. "I want to be direct about that. Anyone saying those things isn't describing the woman I've watched work every day in the coldest winter this territory has seen in a decade, without complaint, without running, and without asking for anything she hasn't earned." The crowd was fully quiet now. Evelyn had stopped moving. She stood near the trading post with her hands in her coat pockets and her heart doing something complicated, and didn't look away. "She's not my charity case," Wyatt said. "She's not my servant, and she is not a subject for other people's stories." He paused one final time. "That's all I wanted to say." He turned away from the fence and walked toward her, and the crowd parted for him, the same way it had parted that morning 2 months ago when he'd ridden in on the bay horse, not because anyone had been told to move, but because there are people who move through a space in a way that doesn't require asking. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the crowd around them was doing the thing crowds do when they've witnessed something they need to process: the murmur and the shuffle, and the deliberate resumption of other activities. "That was—" she started. "Don't," he said quietly. She stopped. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "That's all." There was more happening in the space between them than either of them had words for yet, and they both knew it, and both chose, by some silent mutual agreement, not to push it right now, in the middle of Main Street in Red Hollow, with half the territory watching from the corners of their eyes. They went back to the wagon in the late afternoon as the sun was dropping behind the western hills and the cold was sharpening with intent. Wyatt loaded what he'd bought and unhitched the second horse from the post, and they started north. They were a mile out of town when she said, looking at the road ahead, "Hatcher looked like he agreed with you." "Hatcher's a fair man," Wyatt said. "Willis looked like he was doing math." "Willis always looks like he's doing math. And Briggs will find something else to talk about," Wyatt said, with the flat certainty of a man who knows his own property. She let the silence come back. The hills rolled out around them, white and enormous, and the sky had gone that particular deep blue that comes right before dark in winter, the blue that looks colder than actual dark. The horses moved steadily. Their breath came in slow plumes. After a while, Wyatt said without looking at her, "When we get back." "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words with care. "I'd like to tell you something. When we get back. When the children are in bed." She kept her eyes on the road. Her pulse had done something she was going to pretend for the moment she hadn't noticed. "All right," she said. The wagon moved north through the early dark, and Iron Creek was still an hour away, and the stars were beginning to come out above the mountains, cold and sharp and too numerous to count, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. But the silence between them had changed again. It had a different texture now, The particular texture of two people on the edge of something that has been building for a long time and can't be held back much longer, and both of them feeling the weight of it, and neither quite ready to say so yet. The horses knew the road home. The wagon kept moving. They got back to Iron Creek after dark, as expected. Pete met them in the yard with a lantern, and the information that Clara had reorganized the root cellar without asking anyone. Noah had attempted to teach one of the barn cats to fetch, and had a scratch on his forearm to show for it. And supper had been eaten approximately 2 hours ago because, in Pete's words, the girl decided 6 o'clock was 6 o'clock regardless of who was home. Wyatt took this in without visible reaction. The cat scratch bad? He'll live, Pete said, and went back to the bunkhouse. The twins were still awake, which surprised neither of them. Clara was at the kitchen table with her copybook open in front of her, doing the elaborate pretense of someone who had definitely been doing lessons all evening and had not been waiting. Noah was on the settle in the sitting room with a book upside down on his lap, which told the same story. You were gone a long time, Clara said to her copybook. Business takes time, Wyatt said. Did anything happen? Noah called from the other room, with the studied casualness of someone who absolutely wanted to know if anything had happened. Evelyn hung up her coat. She felt Wyatt's eyes on her briefly, and the thing he'd said on the wagon, "When we get back, I want to tell you something," was still sitting in her chest like a stone she was carefully not pressing on. Get to bed, Wyatt told them. Both of you. I'll come up. Clara finally looked up from her copybook and studied her father's face with the sharp-eyed assessment she'd inherited directly from him. Then she looked at Evelyn, then back at her father. Something moved across her expression. Not surprise, but the look of a person whose suspicion has been confirmed without them being told anything. She closed the copybook and stood up. Fine, she said, in the tone of someone granting a considerable concession. Noah appeared in the doorway, the upside-down book still in his hand. He looked at Evelyn. You're staying, he said. Not a question. I'm staying, she said. He nodded once, the same single nod his father used when a decision had been made and the deciding was done. Then he went upstairs, and Clara followed him, and their footsteps crossed the ceiling above the kitchen. Wyatt went up to see them, as he'd said he would, and Evelyn built the kitchen fire back up and put the kettle on and stood at the stove with her hands wrapped around her own elbows, listening to the muffled sounds of the house settling into its night rhythms, the low voice upstairs, the children's responses, the particular creak of the third stair from the top that she'd memorized without meaning to. She thought about Red Hollow, about standing in the frozen street while Wyatt's voice carried across the crowd, and the people of the territory listened to a man who almost never made speeches make one, for her. She'd spent most of her life being the subject of other people's stories, and she'd learned to carry that with a kind of dense, practiced indifference, a shell she'd grown over years of being the gambler's girl, the charity case, the problem to be managed. What she hadn't known how to carry was being defended, being spoken for, not as property, but as a person worth speaking for. It had done something to the shell that she was still in the process of understanding. She heard his boots on the stairs and turned to the kettle. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, in the chair he always used, and she poured 2 cups without asking and brought them over and sat across from him. The lamp between them was burning low. Outside the kitchen window, the night was clear for the first time in weeks. The storm had taken itself elsewhere, and the stars were out in numbers that had no business existing, brilliant and cold, and completely indifferent to what was happening in the small, warm kitchen below them. Wyatt wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at it for a moment. I've been trying to figure out how to say this, he said. For a while. Take your time, she said. I don't want to take my time, he said. I've been taking my time. That's the problem. He set the cup down. I'm not good at this. I should tell you that first. I know, she said. He looked up at her, and there was something in his face that she recognized now. The stripped-open quality she'd first seen in the hallway during the blizzard night, when he'd stopped managing his expression because he was too tired to maintain it. It was there again now, by choice rather than by exhaustion, which was different, which meant something. When Sarah died, he said, I decided I was done with the parts of life that could be taken away. He said it plainly, without apology or drama, the way he said most things. The ranch can't be taken away if you work it hard enough. The land is always there. The cattle are work, not attachment. He paused. The children I couldn't do anything about. They were already part of me. She waited. I told myself that was enough, he said. The work and the children and the ranch. I told myself wanting more than that was how you got hurt. That's not an unreasonable conclusion, she said carefully. It's not, he agreed. It's also a way of making yourself into something less than what you are. He picked up his cup, set it down again without drinking. You've been in this house for 2 months. You've changed things here that I didn't think could be changed. Not because you came in with some plan, but because you're... He stopped, tried again. Because of who you are. The way you are with the children. The way you are when things go wrong. The way you are when you're just here. The kitchen was very quiet. Even the fire had settled to a low, steady burn. I'm not offering you a transaction, he said. I know how you came here, and I know how it looked, and I know that's the shadow over everything. But what I'm telling you now has nothing to do with what happened in Red Hollow 2 months ago. That's done. What I'm asking you now is something else entirely. He met her eyes across the table. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs you, and not because the children need you, even though both of those things are true. I'd like you to stay because A pause, the briefest one. The pause of a man who has been careful with himself for so long that the act of being uncalculated requires visible effort. Because I don't want to keep figuring out how to live in this house without you in it. Evelyn sat with his words for a moment. Not because she was uncertain, she'd known something of her own answer for a while, longer than she'd admitted to herself. Probably since a night in a blizzard when she'd sat in a dark hallway and heard a grieving man release something he'd been carrying alone for 2 years. But because some things deserve the full weight of the moment they arrive in, and she was not going to shortchange this one. You should know, she said, that I'm not easy to live with. I reorganize things without telling anyone. I have opinions about how the wood stove should be banked, and I know I'm right about them. I talk to the horses when I think no one can hear me. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely, but it moved. I know. I'm also 18 years old, and I don't know how to do half of what a woman in my position is apparently supposed to know how to do. And there are days when I'm holding everything together with wire and stubbornness and not much else. I've noticed, he said, and I came here with nothing, she said, and her voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't entirely even, because this was the part that mattered to her the most. I don't want you to ever think I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. I want to be here because I choose to be here. That's why I'm asking, he said, not assuming, asking. She looked at him across the lamp and the coffee cups and the worn wood of the table that had seen so many meals and silences and small moments of this family learning to function again. And she thought about a girl standing on a platform in the cold with her wrists tied and the crowd watching, and she thought about how the story of that morning had looked, the poverty, the helplessness, the humiliation of being reduced to a number, and how none of it, had predicted this kitchen, this man, this particular moment. Life was strange that way, brutal and strange, and occasionally, unexpectedly, something else entirely. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. I'll stay. Not because I have to. Because I want to. Something in him settled. She could see it, the way a man's whole bearing changes when a tension he's been carrying releases at its root. He didn't reach for her hand across the table, which was very much in character, and she found she preferred it that way. It felt more honest than a sweeping gesture would have. This was who he was, a man who felt things deeply and expressed them sparingly, and she'd learned to read the language of his restraint the way you learn to read a landscape, not in dramatic features, but in the small, reliable details that tell you where you are. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. They sat in the warm kitchen in the quiet house under the vast winter sky, and didn't need to fill the rest of the evening with anything more than that. It was enough. It was, actually, quite a lot. The conversation they'd had at the kitchen table didn't produce any immediate visible change in the household, which was probably appropriate for two people who'd come to their understanding the hard way and weren't interested in fanfare. What it produced instead was a different quality of dailiness. Small things, mostly. Wyatt started coming in for the noon meal instead of eating whatever he found in the barn. He began doing the reading lessons with the twins in the evenings more consistently, sitting at the kitchen table while Evelyn worked nearby, the four of them occupying the same space in a way that had started to feel, without anyone deciding it should, like something that belonged together. Clara, who missed nothing and had been conducting her own private investigation of the situation for weeks, made her position clear on a Tuesday morning in February, standing in the kitchen in her stocking feet with her fresh braid over one shoulder. "Are you going to marry my father?" she asked. Evelyn, who was cutting cornbread, kept cutting. "Where did that question come from?" "I've been thinking about it." "For how long?" "Since approximately the second week," Clara said. Evelyn set down the knife and looked at her. Clara looked back with perfect composure, her gray eyes steady and waiting. She was 9 years old, and she had survived enough to give her the patience of someone considerably older when she chose to deploy it. "Your father and I haven't talked about that specifically," Evelyn said, "but you're not leaving." "No, I'm not leaving," Clara nodded slowly. "Then it'll probably come up," she said, with the confidence of someone who has done her math and trusts her calculations, and went back to the sitting room. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment, then picked up the knife and went back to the cornbread and allowed herself a smile that was only for the kitchen walls and the cast-iron stove and nobody else. It came up on a Sunday evening in late February, in the kind of quiet that settles over a ranch when the week's heaviest work is done, and the night is cold but not dangerous, and there is nowhere particular to be. The twins were in the sitting room, Clara reading and Noah allegedly reading, but actually drawing horses in the margins of his book again. And Wyatt and Evelyn were on the porch in their coats, a thing they'd developed a habit of in the evenings when the weather allowed, standing with their coffee and looking out at the dark hills and the stars that were extraordinary out here, so far from any town, in a way that reminded you the world was larger than your problems. He didn't make a speech. That would have been entirely unlike him. He said, looking at the hills, "I've been thinking." "About," she said, "about what I'd like." He turned his cup in his hands. "What I want this to be, going forward." She waited. "I'd like to do this properly," he said. "If that's something you'd want." She understood what he was saying. The frontier had its own version of formality, stripped down to the functional. He wasn't going to produce a ring or drop to a knee on this porch, because he was Wyatt Boone, and that was not who he was. But properly meant something real. It meant in front of people, with witnesses, with the legal weight that made a thing rather than an arrangement. "I'd want that," she said. He nodded. He kept looking at the hills. "I know I'm not an easy man to—" He stopped himself, recognizing that he was about to say something self-deprecating in the way people do when they're afraid, and that it wasn't honest to the moment. He started over. "I'm better than I was," he said. "I'm not all the way there, but I'm better." "I know," she said. "So am I." He looked at her then, and in the dark his face was open in the way it had become more frequently open since the blizzard night. Less the face of a man managing his circumstances, and more the face of a man who had decided, at some cost, to live in them. "In the spring," he said, "when the weather's cleared." "In the spring," she agreed. From inside the house, audible through the window, came Clara's voice telling Noah he was drawing in his book again, and Noah's voice saying it wasn't his book, and the comfortable low escalation of an argument that had no real anger in it, just the noise of two children who had learned that making noise in a warm house with people who would answer was a pleasure rather than a risk. Wyatt turned his head toward the window. Something moved through his face, soft and unguarded, the way a man looks at the thing he almost lost and didn't. "She's going to want to have opinions about the arrangements," he said. "She already has opinions about the arrangements," Evelyn said. "She's had them since approximately the second week." He looked at her. "She told you that?" "Tuesday morning, in the kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. "What exactly did she say?" "She said it would probably come up." He made a sound, low and brief, more exhale than laugh, but in the territory between the two, and turned back to the hills and drank his coffee. They stood on the porch until the cold drove them in, and the night was extraordinary around them, and neither of them needed to say more. The wedding happened in the last week of March, when the snow had finally started pulling back from the lower hills and the creek was running high with melt, and there were, for the first time since October, a few stubborn hours of genuine warmth in the middle of the day. The small wooden church near the base of the Iron Creek Ridge had been built by homesteaders a decade before and served the spread-out community of ranchers and families in a 15-mile radius. It held perhaps 60 people when full. On the morning of the wedding, It held more than that. Evelyn stood in the small room off the side entrance and looked at herself in the mirror that Reyes had carried over from the ranch house in the back of the wagon 3 days earlier. Because there was no mirror in the church, and Clara had determined that there needed to be one, and once Clara determined something, the matter was generally resolved in Clara's favor. The dress was blue, a deep, practical blue that had been Evelyn's own choice, because she was not a white dress person and never had been, and wasn't going to start being one now. It had been made by a woman in Red Hollow named Mrs. Albright, who'd been doing dress work for 30 years, and who, when Wyatt had brought Evelyn in to discuss the commission, had looked at Evelyn for a long moment and then said briskly, "She needs something that suits her, not something that suits the occasion." Evelyn had liked her immediately. Clara was behind her, conducting final adjustments to the back of the dress, with an intensity that suggested the fate of the territory depended on the placement of each button. Noah stood near the door with his hands in his pockets, wearing his good coat that Evelyn had mended 3 times over the winter, looking at the middle distance with the particular expression of a 9-year-old boy who has been told he is not allowed to have feelings about this, but is having them anyway. "Stop moving," Claire said. I'm not moving," Evelyn said. "You're breathing too much. It shifts things." "I have to breathe." "Not that dramatically." Clara stepped back and assessed her work with narrowed eyes. "Okay, you look good." "High praise," Evelyn said. "It's accurate praise," Clara said, which was exactly the kind of distinction Clara would make, and Evelyn loved her completely for it. Noah pushed off from the door frame and walked over and stood in front of her and looked up at her with his father's eyes and said, "You don't have to be nervous." "I know," she said. "Do you, though?" he said. "Because you keep doing the thing with your hands." She looked at her hands. She'd pressed them together without noticing. She made herself relax them. "I'm fine," she said. "You're nervous," he said. "It's okay." He shrugged. "Dad was nervous this morning, too. He dropped his cup." "Your father dropped his cup?" "In the kitchen, before we left. He picked it up real fast and looked around to see if anyone saw." Noah's face was entirely serious. "I saw. I didn't say anything." Evelyn looked at this 9-year-old boy who had spent 2 years being guarded and watchful and waiting for the next person to leave, and who was standing in front of her in his mended coat, offering her, in his own way, the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone in what she was feeling. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, that single nod, inherited and entirely his own, and stepped back. The church was full when they brought her to the entrance. She could hear it before she could see it. The sound of that many people in a small building, the shuffling and murmuring that goes quiet all at once when a door opens. She stood at the threshold for a moment and looked down the aisle. Wyatt was at the far end beside the circuit preacher who came through this territory 3 times a year and had a practical, unsentimental approach to the ceremony that suited everyone involved. Wyatt stood straight, in his good dark coat, his hat in his hands. He was looking at the door. His face was doing the open, unmanaged thing, and even from this distance she could see it. She thought of something her mother used to say in the last years, when the illness had stripped away everything except what mattered. The thing about a hard life is it teaches you exactly how much the good parts cost, and that makes you value them right. Her mother had been right about that, about the cost and the value and the way one informed the other. She walked down the aisle. The people gathered there were a mix she wouldn't have predicted. Ranchers who'd done business with Wyatt for a decade, their wives and families, some of the hands from neighboring spreads. Old Pete, sitting in the front row with his hat on his knee, looking somewhere between proud and deeply uncomfortable with the formality of the whole situation. Hatcher from the Southern Range, who'd given Wyatt a nod at the cattle gathering that had said more than most men said in paragraphs. Mrs. Albright, who'd made the dress, sitting with her back straight, and her expression suggesting she'd known it would come out well. And in the second row, partially obscured but not making any real effort to hide, Briggs. She saw him when she was halfway down. He was sitting with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the flat expression of a man who has been wrong about something and is not going to make a production of admitting it, but is present, which is its own kind of admission. She held his eyes for a moment as she passed. He looked away first. She kept walking. Clara was beside Wyatt at the front, standing straight in her good dress with her braid over her shoulder, holding herself with the composure of someone who had planned extensively for this moment and was determined it was going to be executed correctly. Noah was on the other side, hands in his pockets still, jaw set. They had positioned themselves, without anyone telling them to, flanking their father, which said everything about how they understood what this day meant. She stopped in front of Wyatt. He looked at her. His hands were still, the hat held between them. His face said 100 things he hadn't said and probably wouldn't say in those exact words, and she could read most of them now, after months of learning his language. "You look," he started. "Don't say what you're going to say," she said quietly, because whatever he was going to say was going to produce a reaction she didn't want to have in front of 60 people. The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. The ceremony was short and direct, the way both of them would have wanted it. The preacher was a practical man and got through the essential parts without embellishment. When the moment came for the speaking of vows, Wyatt said his in a voice that was completely steady, which she knew now was not the absence of feeling, but its opposite. The effort of someone who feels things at a depth that requires control, and who is choosing, in this moment, to give her the controlled version because the alternative would undo him in front of 60 people, and he wasn't quite there yet. That was all right. She knew what was underneath it. She said her own vows in a voice that was also steady, more or less, with one small break on the word home that she allowed and didn't apologize for. Clara made a small sound from her right that might have been a sniffle and might have been a critical assessment of the acoustic quality of the church. Noah, on the other side, looked at the ceiling. And then it was done. The gathered people of the territory made the noise that gathered people make when something has been finalized, and the preacher closed his book. And Wyatt looked at her with his open face in the small church on the edge of the winter-cold hills, and she thought, "This is real. This is mine. I didn't trade my way into it, and I didn't survive my way into it. I worked for it. We both did. That mattered. It mattered more than the ceremony itself, more than the dress and the witnesses and the legal weight of the thing. The how of it mattered. The fact that she could look at every step of the road that had brought her here and say, honestly, without flinching, that she had been herself at every point. She hadn't made herself small or dishonest or convenient. She had just been Evelyn, which had been, apparently, exactly enough. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, because Iron Creek was the largest property, and there was no venue in the territory that could accommodate the people who'd come. And because Clara had decided it was going to be at the ranch, and had begun planning the logistics approximately 3 weeks prior without asking anyone's permission. The kitchen had been producing food since before dawn. Evelyn and Mrs. Albright and 2 women from the neighboring spreads had been at it since first light, and the tables set up in the front room held more food than Evelyn had seen assembled in one place since before her father had started losing things. Noah had made bread, 3 loaves of it, and when Reyes told him it was the best bread he'd had in years, the boy stood in the middle of the room looking like he didn't know what to do with that information, but was going to hold on to it indefinitely. People ate and talked and moved through the ranch house with the unselfconscious ease of a community that had decided to accept something. It wasn't universal. There were people present who had their reservations and were keeping them politely to themselves. And Evelyn understood that some stories take longer to rewrite than others, and she was prepared to be patient. She had practice at being patient. What she hadn't expected was Briggs. He found her in the kitchen, in the middle of the afternoon, when she'd gone to refill the coffee pot and had a few minutes of relative quiet. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, a detail she noticed because she'd never seen him without it before, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a proud man doing something difficult. "I was wrong about you," he said. No preamble, no setup, just the statement, flat and direct. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it out loud." "All right." He nodded. He looked like a man who had done what he came to do and wasn't sure whether to stay or go. She made the decision for him. "There's coffee," she said. "Get yourself a cup." He did. They didn't have a long conversation, and they weren't going to be friends, and she wasn't interested in pretending the preceding months hadn't happened. But there was something in the simple act of him standing in her kitchen, drinking coffee he'd been offered, that closed something. Not forgiveness exactly. She wasn't going to give him a speech about forgiveness that neither of them needed. Just the acknowledgement that people can be wrong and then less wrong, which was about as much as you could ask of most people, herself included. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned to the people who lived closest and had nowhere urgent to be, and the food had been reduced to the comfortable debris of a good meal well attended, and the twins had been up since before dawn and were visibly running on determination alone. Clara was sitting in the corner of the sitting room with her shoes off and her head against the armrest, conducting what she would firmly maintain was a rest and not a nap. Noah had given up the pretense entirely and was asleep on the settle under someone's discarded coat. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the sitting room, at the sleeping children and the low fire and the people still talking quietly at the edges of the room, and felt the day in her body, the full weight of it, good and exhausting and real. Wyatt came up beside her. He stood close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, looking at the same room. "Claire's going to tell me she wasn't sleeping," he said. "Obviously," Evelyn said, "and she's going to have an opinion about how the coffee ran out too early. She mentioned that to me at approximately 2:30. She has thoughts about the pot size." He was quiet for a moment. "She's been planning this day since February." "She told me approximately the second week," Evelyn said. He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back, and it was, as it almost always was with them, a great deal more than what was said, and both of them were fine with that. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For—" He stopped, tried a different angle. "For not running." She thought about the morning she'd arrived and the cold, and the house that had felt haunted. She thought about Clara at the table not eating her breakfast, and Noah watching from the doorways. She thought about the blizzard night and the hallway and the 2 cups of coffee on the kitchen table in the lamplight. "I almost didn't stay," she said. "The first week. There was a morning, maybe day 5, when I stood in this kitchen at 4 in the morning and thought about walking back to Red Hollow." He looked at her steadily. "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Claire's braid," she said, finally. "I'd seen her trying to do it herself, and I kept thinking, someone has to show her how to do that properly. Someone has to teach her." She paused, "and I wanted it to be me." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back at the room, at the sleeping children, at the fire. "I'm glad," he said, "for what it's worth. I'm very glad it was you." The last guest left as the sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the ranch settled back into its own company, and Evelyn and Wyatt and the 2 children were left in the warm house as the early dark came on. Noah woke up indignant about the coat and demanding to know whose it was. Clara came fully awake with the speed of someone who had definitely not been sleeping and began immediately assessing the state of the kitchen with a critical eye, which Evelyn chose to find endearing rather than exhausting. They cleaned up together, all 4 of them, the twins washing and drying because they'd been assigned the task before they could evade it, Wyatt taking the furniture back to where it belonged, Evelyn working through the kitchen in the efficient, methodical way she worked through everything. It was unglamorous and slightly chaotic, and Noah dropped a plate that was mercifully tin and didn't break, and Clara argued with him about whether it had been his fault, which it had. Just a family, at the end of a long day cleaning up. Evelyn thought about all the different ways this story could have ended. The auction platform was the obvious place to start. She could have gone with Devers, who'd buried 2 wives. She could have gone with Fitch, who worked people until there was nothing left. She could have been bought by someone whose version of settling a debt involved things she didn't let herself think about directly. The frontier was not a forgiving place for young women without money or family or options, and the road she'd actually traveled was not the only road that had been available. But she'd ended up here, not because the world had been kind to her. The world had been spectacularly unkind to her for most of her 18 years. Not because she'd been saved, in the simple storybook sense of the word. Wyatt hadn't saved her in that sense. She'd saved herself over and over, in the small daily ways, by staying when running would have been easier, by choosing to see the children clearly rather than managing them from a distance, by being honest with herself about what she felt and what she wanted even when both were inconvenient. What Wyatt had given her was not rescue. It was a place to do that work in. And what she'd given him, she thought, was more or less the same. A person standing next to him who didn't require him to be other than he was, who read his silences without demanding he fill them, and who had been, over months of cold mornings and difficult evenings and one terrible night, simply and consistently present. They had built something together, imperfectly, out of 2 broken situations, And it wasn't finished. It would never be entirely finished, because nothing worth having ever is. There would be hard winters ahead, and arguments, and days when the ranch tried to break them, and days when they tired each other. Wyatt was still not an easy man. She was still stubborn in ways that would cause friction. Clara would always have opinions. Noah would always need the world to make sense on his own terms before he could trust it. But they were all, she thought, better at this than they had been. And being better was the whole point. Not perfect. The word had no application here, in this cracked and weathered and genuinely difficult life on the edge of the frontier. Just better. More honest, more willing to need each other. That was enough. That was honestly remarkable. Later that night, when the children were finally and indisputably asleep, and the house was dark and quiet around them, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the hills. The snow had retreated from the lower slopes and left the ground raw and dark, the way the land looks in early spring when winter has let go of it, but growth hasn't started yet. The in-between, the unglamorous moment of transition that happens before anything visible changes. She'd always thought it was the most honest season, not the drama of the storm, not the soft arrival of green, just the bare ground saying, "Here, I'm still here. What comes next is what comes next." She heard Wyatt come into the kitchen behind her, and she didn't turn around. He stood behind her and looked out at the same window, at the same hills, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered the honest answer, which was complicated and layered and would take a while to say properly, and she thought about how to compress it into something true. "That this is where my life started," she said. "The actual one." He was quiet for a moment. "This place," she said. "This house. You and the children." She paused. "The place where I nearly ended up with nothing is the place where I ended up with everything that matters." She felt him move, and then his hand was at her shoulder, and she turned toward him, and the kitchen was warm and the night was cold outside the glass, and the hills were dark and patient under the emerging stars. She had 14 cents in her coat pocket the morning this began. She had the hole in her left boot sole and a canvas sack for a pillow, and a father who had chosen the road over his own daughter. She had now more than she'd known was possible to have, not in the way of things, but in the way of here, of belonging somewhere, of being known by people who had chosen to keep knowing her, and of knowing them in return, completely, in all their difficulty and grief and stubborn, imperfect love. The frontier stretched away beyond the window, enormous and cold and beautiful in its harshness, the way things are beautiful when they don't pretend to be other than what they are. She was still standing. She was home.